Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain Bully. This movie tells the story of a fat boy who is always bullied at school. His life changes when he decides to learn boxing and fight back against his bullies. Can he win against the bullies? Let's find out in Bully. Bully begins by showing 3 school delinquents led by a student named Miles. The 3 only came to school to bully other students they considered weak. One of the students who is always the target of their bullying is a fat young man named Jimmy Mulligan. Despite being bullied by Miles all the time, Jimmy never fought him. At school, Jimmy has 2 friends named Andy and Bobby who always support him. Not only that, he also has very caring and loving parents. One day, Jimmy and his friends bump into Miles and the gang on their way to school. Miles and his friends ask Jimmy for $100. That kind of money was clearly too much for him who came from a simple family. Even though he had told him that he didn't have that much money, Miles didn't care and still forced Jimmy to give him $100. Not only Jimmy, Miles also often bullies Bobby who behaves feminine like a woman. Jimmy tries to comfort and calm Bobby after Miles humiliates him in front of the class. Jimmy then invited his friends to eat in the cafeteria and promised to treat them. Andy and Bobby were surprised in the cafeteria because Jimmy could eat a huge portion of food. Even so, they never made fun of him for his big appetite. After that, Andy and Bobby try to match Jimmy with a girl at their school named Adrian, because they often catch her who secretly always steals glances at Jimmy when they are eating in the cafeteria. Shortly after, Miles appeared and sat next to Jimmy charging for the $100 he'd asked for. One of the students who was disturbed by Miles' presence then asked him not to make a mess and leave the cafeteria. Getting a reprimand from the students who he considered weak, Miles responded by yelling and berating the student with harsh words. But then, another student who is physically bigger and stronger than Miles wants to teach him a lesson for making a fuss in the cafeteria while everyone is eating lunch. In an instant, Miles's guts shrunk and he immediately walked away from the cafeteria. After school, Miles confronted Jimmy again and forced him to hand him a $100 bill. However, Jimmy insisted that he didn't have that much money and didn't owe Miles anything, so he was no obligation to hand over the cash to Miles. Hearing Jimmy's words which implied resistance, Miles did not hesitate to beat him on the side of the road. Miles has just stopped beating Jimmy when an old man arrives and threatens Miles to file a complaint with the police. Miles immediately stepped on the gas and left the place. The old man then helped Jimmy and took him to his house to treat his injuries. The man introduced himself as Mr. Actions. While at Mr. Actions' house, Jimmy finds out that he used to be a world heavyweight boxer. Jimmy then begged Mr. Action to train him to become a boxer so that he can fight Miles and stop the bullying. The old man was willing to help Jimmy beat Miles, but he was too old to coach him. Mr. Action says that he will ask his friends to help train him. After that, Mr. Action takes Jimmy home and tells his parents about Jimmy's beating incident. Jimmy's parents are very grateful for Mr. Action has treated Jimmy and is willing to take him home. They immediately gave Jimmy permission to practice boxing according to Mr. Actions. They even accompanied Jimmy to the boxing training arena belonging to Manny. Mr. Action then tells Manny about Jimmy's problems. Manny agrees to help Jimmy, as long as he is serious and doesn't give up because boxing training is tough. After accepting it, Jimmy began to regularly practice boxing with Manny, while Mr. Action closely monitors his progress at every training session. Jimmy then told about Miles who often forced him to give him $100. Mr. Action then suggested that Jimmy double Miles' request to $200, on the condition that he had to give him 1 month. Mr. Action proposes that Jimmy can prepare himself and succeed in overthrowing Miles at the appointed time, so that he doesn't have to give the $200 to Miles. The next day, Jimmy followed the advice of Mr. Action when Miles returns to collect the money from him. Miles seemed to consider for a moment because the time period was quite long. However, he finally agreed to give Jimmy a month-long deadline because Jimmy doubled the amount of money. For a while, Jimmy could breathe a sigh of relief that Miles was no longer bothering him about money. However, when Jimmy trains boxing with Manny in the afternoon, he looks lethargic and uninspired. Jimmy argued that he felt exhausted, but he couldn't fool Manny's professional observations, who knew for a fact that Jimmy wasn't physically exhausted, but mentally. Manny then told Mr. Action about Jimmy's condition that he started not being serious in training. While on his way home, Mr. Action asked Jimmy why he wasn't in the mood for practice that day. Jimmy then replied that he was getting tired and felt that all the training he had been doing was not producing any results. He remains weak and unable to stand up for himself when Miles bullies him. Hearing Jimmy discouraged, Mr. Action tries to cheer him up by saying that no effort is wasted and that whatever the outcome, he will learn a valuable lesson from his efforts. When he got home, his father also noticed that he was losing his enthusiasm for training. His father didn't force him to continue his training and left all the decisions to him. But then, his father said that one day he hoped Jimmy could teach his children how to defend themselves so that their children would not have to suffer the same fate as him. After reflecting on his father's words, Jimmy's fighting spirit rekindled and he was determined to keep practicing seriously. The next day, Miles and his group again intimidate Jimmy and his friends. They even did not hesitate to beat Bobby in front of many people. Jimmy then approached Bobby, who was crying alone, and tried to comfort him. But Bobby says that he's desperate because they can't do anything against Miles and his friends. Jimmy disagrees and tells Bobby that he has a way to beat Miles and stop their bullying. Arriving at home, Jimmy rushed to Manny's boxing gym by riding a bicycle, even though he had always been picked up by Mr. Action because the distance to the boxing gym is quite far. Mr. Action is very happy because Jimmy is excited to join boxing training again. In fact, so excited, Jimmy accidentally hit Manny and fell to the ground. Instead of being angry, Manny was happy that Jimmy was getting serious about boxing again. Long story short, day after day, Jimmy trains boxing with strong determination and a burning passion. Manny increased Jimmy's training portion with heavier physical training and mixed martial arts. On the other hand, Mr. Action trains Jimmy's mentality by giving advice and suggestions to inspire his fighting spirit. Meanwhile at school, Jimmy tells Andy about the boxing training he went through to beat Miles. At the same time, Adrian approaches Jimmy and the two agree to date. Adrian and Jimmy go to a party at their friend's house. After engaging in a heart-to-heart chat, they realized they were pretty compatible and connected when they talked about many things. They decided to date. While busy on a date, Eddie, one of Miles' men, annoys Jimmy and Adrian by hurling insults. However, Jimmy, who is now more confident, then tries to fight Eddie and throw him out. Time passed, until it was time for Jimmy to keep his promise to Miles. However, Jimmy was determined not to let Miles blackmail and bully him again. That morning, he woke up with a burst of confidence and a burning determination. Arriving at school, Miles immediately approached him and threatened to hurt his friends if he broke his promise and tried to run away. While in the restroom, Jimmy meets a young man who introduces himself as Vinny, who finds out about his and Miles' feud. Vinny, who also knew that Jimmy had been practicing boxing at Manny's boxing gym, then encouraged and wished him good luck. Unbeknownst to Jimmy and Vinny, Eddie, who was in the toilet cubicle, overheard their conversation and reported it to Miles. At Miles' orders, Eddie then calls a recidivist known as Glass Jaw Billy to come to school and become Jimmy's match. The feud between Jimmy and Miles seems to have spread throughout the school and attracts everyone's attention to see firsthand who will be the winner. Confidently, Jimmy went to Miles and his friends. Miles, who already knows that Jimmy won't give him the money, plans to beat him down with the help of Glass Jaw. However, Vinny acts faster by sending his men to kidnap Glass Jaw, so Miles inevitably has to fight Jimmy with his own hands. The fight began. At first, Jimmy had difficulty dealing with Miles. However, he did not give up and rose against Miles. Jimmy was able to parry Miles' attack and throw a raw bombard in Miles' face. Now Jimmy was no longer a weak fat boy who let people bully him. He can now defend himself and is determined to become stronger to defend the weak from oppression. Seeing Miles starting to get cornered, his friends then tried to gang up on Jimmy. However, Andy and Bobby did not remain silent. The two of them helped Jimmy fight his bullies until they can finally defeat Miles and his friends. After winning the feud, Jimmy tells Miles to stop bullying everyone at school. But Miles doesn't seem to care. On the other hand, Mr. Action, who witnessed Jimmy's feud against Miles behind the crowd, looked very proud of his protege because even though Jimmy had become stronger now, he still had a good heart. Apparently, the feud between Jimmy and Miles went viral after being uploaded to social media platforms by the people who recorded the incident. It was so excited that the videotape was even reported on a local television channel, so that Jimmy's actions against his bullies became a topic of conversation in the community. They all applaud Jimmy's courage to stand up to the bullies. His parents also feel proud because now their son can stand up for himself and is no longer bullied. The film ends by showing Jimmy, Andy, Bobby, and Adrian, who are now more confident and have become the center of attention at school after their success in overthrowing a group of bullies who were troubling the students at the school. Actually, pushing someone is easy, until finally that person pushes you back. For that, don't bully people for any reason and think of yourself as a perfect person, because everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. The film ends.